Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Reinhard Müller. I would like to welcome you to this social hotspot in Salzburg. When I was working for the FSZ, I think this was the most thrilling summer slump which I experienced, but so it is very important to immerse yourself in important questions. Here on stage, Mr. KORIOTH, holding a chair of Public Law and Law of the Churches at the LMU Munich, then Mr. Huber, former judge of the Federal Constitutional Court, Professor MELLINGHOF, President of the Federal Court of Finance, and Mr. HOEREN. He teaches media law at the University of Münster. Mr. Huber, do you envy the British that they were given a chance to have a direct vote over a central question like leaving the EU? Well, I should say that this is a difficult question. I should say that Europe would do better if there would be more feedback, that is, thinking more about the feelings and emotions of the voters. In Germany, at least since the Maastricht contract, we've discussed again and again that this feedback is not intense enough. Now, if you look at the fact that no European integration step has been conducted without resorting to the Federal Court of Justice. And Mrs. Flick said that a series or a number of citizens really went to the court, and we had 14,000 complainants at the time. Against this backdrop, we have to say that this is a kind of venting mechanisms where people try to have themselves heard. And it is also a question of identity, as it was worded later. So envy, well, it is limited, and looking at the result in particular, I'm not really envious, but I have no doubt that in Germany we also have to think about the fact how we can handle rules and regulations which will control the integration into the European Union and bring it back to the citizens more than in the past. Now, Mr. MELLINGHOF, in Germany, for instance, the citizens are allowed to have a voice on a communal level, so they can take part in referendums, but not on a federal level. Why not? Well, this is what the basic law stipulates. Surely you may say we can change that. Do you think it should be changed? No. I am convinced that it is not necessary to change it. But we have a representative democracy, and if groups want to voice their opinions, if there are groups of voters getting together anew, then this is good. We have seen it with the Greens, now with the AfD. I think these are clear signals to the politicians that they really have to do some thinking. That is, whether or not they should listen to the voters more so than in the past. Against this backdrop, I believe that these are far-reaching questions, and I don't think it is necessary to hold referendums on a federal level. And looking at the Länder, you know, there are certain limitations, certain restrictions. Financial questions, for instance, are not allowed to be voted on in a referendum. I know there are a series of complex questions, and, you know, the Senate was removed, so sometimes complex questions are even discussed on a state level. We're removing an organ which is very difficult to see, and, you know, leaving the European Union, this is not a complex issue, you know. It is just a question whether or not you want to have a certain position within a union. So I think it is very easy to answer this question, but the crucial question is whether you or who is to be given the competency to take certain basic or fundamental decisions, and who you believe is the right entity to take into account all aspects of an issue. What would you say? Well, you know, Turkey's access to the EU, well, you know, I would like to pose the question whether it really makes such a big difference on a federal level in Germany if there were the possibility to have referendums about many say, subjects, because the basic level says it very clear that we can have referendums on a Länder level. So if we want to restructure the federal structure, then this cannot be done without the vote of the people. And I believe this is an interesting aspect. Against the backdrop of what we've just heard, it is about the identity. It is affected their feeling of, cohesion. Where do we belong to? So in this respect, on a highest level, in a political system, plebiscites should be held, whether this makes sense. Well, I'm not against amending the basic law. And there are two groups of questions for which I can imagine that things like this is possible. Basic questions like political identity. Who are we? Everyone has got an opinion on that, and everyone can form an opinion. Everyone has got an idea about this, what this is all about. And then there might be questions which, bring politics in a certain direction. All the other things in a democracy, hundreds and thousands of decisions which have to be taken every day or month in specialized areas, I think they are not really suited to direct elements of democracy. But I think, it is not necessary to be overly cautious whether or not we want to have something like this in Germany on a federal level. And, in Europe, there are many movements, populist movements. They also show and demonstrate the tiredness with the parliamentary system in Europe. Do you think that direct democracy is a solution in order to fight this fatigue, political fatigue? Well, I try to bridge the gap, direct participation of citizens. Maybe I'm the wrong person, the odd man out in this round. I had a chance to talk to young people, and I organized this group of young people, Convoco 3.0. The subject was blockchain. And this brings me back to your question. There is a movement of the nerds, the uprising of the nerds, that they program or want to have control over financial instruments, governments, states, and, they control their own movement, and they are quite successful. With Mr. Mamoto, nobody knows who he is. In 2008, he wrote an essay about this, and since then, young people are really thinking about blockchains and bitcoins. That is, they try to use them, and this, of course, involves lots of the dangers, which we also discussed this morning. Now, this is a form of democracy, isn't it? Well, this is only proof of something new, something alternative emerging. You mentioned the first person plural. This means we have got a new feeling, a we feeling worldwide. So this goes beyond state borders. It's got nothing to do with national aspects. This means the programmers of this world are getting together to bring new transparency into administration and other structures, with all the problems that brings this along. Surely we've got a few questions like money laundering, bitcoins, or criminal law, fraud, felonies, etc. Surely we also want to know, and nobody really knows, who are these nerds? Who are we? Who is the first person plural they are talking about? Well, this we, on a European level, it is very difficult to define this term, what it means. And you get to the global level. But have we got a we in Europe which is forming right now, or have we seen national identities, which means we are moving backwards in time, that we do not have a trade union or just a trade union and not more? I believe this is a question which everyone can and has to answer for him or herself, surely. But, being a European and a German at the same time, this is possible, some say, but all this depends on personal preferences. But, it is a fact that this we, or rather the national states, have got a tradition. It is influenced by the Oder flood or any tax reforms, and solidarity on a large scale is possible, or becomes possible against this background. And it certainly is a prerequisite which we need, but we do not have this on a European level. And, you know, there is this famous word that the state or the constitution lives of conditions which it cannot create itself. And this, of course, also refers to political players on the political stage. The first person plural can be organized in such a way, or as long as it is accepted. And this brings me to authority, which we've discussed over the last 2 days. That is where you haven't got any authority for redistribution issues, for instance, for decisions related to identity or politics. In this case, political organizations will fail, and therefore I believe it can only be a matter of prudence that we live in Europe and organize things in Europe on a national level in such a way that the responsibilities and decisions are taken on the right level. You know, if Russia threatens Europe, then we will feel ourselves to be Europeans. But the Club Mediterranee, you know, had a look at our pension funds, but in this case, we would consider ourselves less of a we. So I think there is no common answer or all-encompassing answer. Well, you see, the Brexit referendum was such that the government said, I'm going to have you vote on this. And this was done in a way to form identity from the bottom rather than from the top. You know, whether it is possible to form a unity from the top or from the bottom, but it is also a matter of trust, because a unity is formed nevertheless. But let me come back to the blockchain and the bitcoins. I would like to talk about them again because it shows the problem behind it all. Because you've got a small group of nerds, or whatever they are, or as you mentioned them, those being the opinion leaders take over, say, the opinion of a large group of people. And this means that at the same time they also exclude a large group of people. When it comes to authorities, which should have responsibility for this or that aspect. So if somebody's been voted into a parliament, then this authority must be given responsibility, and they have to assume the responsibility. Surely it's also about freedom of opinion, but you know, if there are certain elements in our society really take on the dominance or the control of, say, the construction of the financial markets, you know, then of course they will bring in their opinions, and this is what they should do in a democracy, taking into account the respective processes. But if they assume a responsibility, then I want to assign this responsibility to a parliamentarian, and this is why we have the parliaments. You know, the fatigue of people with politics. Do you think that representatives of the population think of their parties more than of the common weal? Well, surely representatives are necessary, and there is lots of leeway which has for improvements, and there must be improvements. This is out of the question. Today we've got a dominance of parties when it comes to, say, staff or other factual decisions. But when it comes to the authority that is, and this is what Mr. Huber mentioned, you know, you might find different structures strengthening the role of the party on the one hand, but on the other hand, not each and every, say, staff decision has to be, say, trickled down to a much lower level. I believe this is very important. So we cannot hold the parties to account rather the representatives. You see, it is my opinion and also my experience that personal, say, destinies can I feed or provide for my family if I lose my job? Do I have to accept certain constraints in order to be considered an individual or a family? Will I be able to survive in these surroundings? This is very important. At the same time, the parties also and the representative also have a strong influence. And yesterday we discussed that there is a difference between the representatives of, say, a district or those who are voted in through the list. So there is some kind of responsiveness. And the constituencies have a chance to, eliminate the representative if they are not happy. So this is the mechanism of a party, say, ruled government. And to what extent this affects, say, politicians or representatives, here lots of things are mitigated. And this is in contrast to what Mr. Mellinghof said. Against this backdrop, we have to think about finding instruments which we can use in order to cushion the effects when representation is to be broken up. And here democracy comes on stage because it will have the highest authority. It will also put in more relative terms when it comes to finding decisions, so that decisions are not only done in party headquarters, but the decisions come from the bottom upwards and is not grafted onto the population from the top. When looking at our legislation, then I can say that politics haven't answered questions satisfactorily, at least in the eyes of the public. And Mr. KORIOTH, now thinking about this party state, which is defined in our base law, requires certain correcting elements. And of course the democracy could be such a correcting element. It is often said that there is no alternative. Well, talking about plebiscites or running or exercising a referendum, you need 1 year of a campaign. You need thousands of people who support you. You need, say, sponsors who help you financing such a campaign. Even in countries who carry out referendums or plebiscites frequently, do not have such referendums frequently. It may not be an alternative to a representational democracy, but at least it helps to bring to the fore the opinions of those of the population. And, paternalistic domination, sometimes things are a bit difficult. And one aspect that you don't want to speak too long. And there's one aspect which we haven't touched on. The Archimedes point of democracy. We all are this point. This is the basis of democracies, and not like the nerds who give themselves responsibility and power. The pursuit of happiness, that is, we are the people. I believe this is the point of departure for democracy. And against this backdrop, I should say, we have to think about whether it is sufficient how we organized our democratic principles. Now, looking at the Thuringia CDU, or in Switzerland, you give the population to have a vote on each and every parliamentary law. Is that a good idea? Are you against? Well, I must say I'm skeptical in some aspects, and listening to what Mr. Huber said, there's one aspect where I'm cautious. He said direct democracy or democratic elements might be a correcting element. I would say this is complementing these principles. These should not be contradictions in terms. Direct democracy on the one hand And on the other hand, this correcting element, a real correcting element, if there are any flaws in a representational system, if things do not work out how we believe they should work, and this is what happens in each and every representational democracy. There has never been a system where the chain of responsibilities, dialogue, decision, responsibility, trust has worked properly and 100%. This will happen in an ideal world only. But if there are problems, if there are flaws in the representational system, then I believe it is wrong to repair things by means of direct democracy. Now, somebody might come up with the idea that we can combine and couple plebiscites and democracy in such a way that is representational democracy on the one hand and then the referendums, so add this referendum to the representational system, then we will end up with a problem. It might not lead to the results which you would like to have, and it will not help the democracy. I've got 3 opposing examples. Schleswig-Holstein, several years ago, decided to maintain the old orthography using a plebiscite because they didn't approve of red tape introducing or forcing the new orthography on population. Now we've got new orthography and people changed this law and it's been accepted. Now in Hamburg, we've got another situation when looking at elections. And in Bavaria, we also had nice experience. You see, the Landtag, the parliament, tried to control the ban on smoking in restaurants. They didn't succeed, and only a referendum helped them. And now, even at the Oktoberfest, there is a ban on smoking. So you may say that this is a complement or this is a correcting element. Well, in some cases, you may use it if the representational democracy doesn't bring about good results. And it might also help to correct, say, flaws or faults coming or being introduced by a parliament. So we just have to make sure that the end result are not, say, major distortions. What I want to say is, there are powerful minorities, individuals. Shall they be given the opportunity to, say, make laws? Well, what I miss in this discussion, we are talking about the discussion, or we're having a kind of discussion of old people, of old men. I represent young men, and, we discussed issues with these young men this morning. And I believe people underestimate the internet, the effort for organizing such a campaign. Estonia, they are a group and they try to set up systems and they call it EA Estonia to run campaigns very quickly. These campaigns over the internet led to organize a shitstorm, and the effect of this means that the classical politics, the parties, lose its significance. People do not use parties to define their own opinions. They define themselves via campaigns which can be easily financed, which can be conducted very quickly. So all this through the internet. It is always a matter of time. It is a matter of discussing things. The politicians have to voice their opinions. It's not click, 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 which Mr. Sturgeon mentioned. It is not a gut feeling or rather a gut decision. So I think in this case we have to counteract developments in this direction. You see, I just heard, as Mr. KORIOTH said, that you have to have votes on issues creating identities, and the ban on smoking or Stuttgart 21. I want to say, are these issues creating identity for our population, for our people? Are these the issues which this is all about? And looking at the plebiscites, don't you think that these are individual questions or issues which have been singled out here or there? And, orthography, then this Stuttgart issue, ban on smoking. It is not about the forward-looking questions like Brexit. They are not about questions like these. Yes, and now the audience. Questions, please. Yes, of course, you can ask questions about all issues. Mr. Berger, I'm sorry to ask this question now, but it just sprang up in my mind. The EU, which has got a parliament, which a minority of the Europeans elect, is it a democracy? Could you please give us a definition of this? Well, let me answer, if I may. It is a difficult question. We should say yes. Surely there are various ways of democratic feedback. They work as good in a nation state, but maybe better than at the UN. So I should say the European Union is based on a democratic principle. We just have to do things better. Mr. MELLINGHOF, democracy, one man, one vote. And if you look at how far we are away from this principle, then of course, things are a bit difficult. Other questions? Yes, please. I am thinking about two issues following up on Estonia and that they organized a shitstorm. The question is, do we have the opposite of a shitstorm, something which is constructive, something which is positive, not only belittling things or making things worse? Is it also possible to put forward constructive opinion and then do something? And another question. The Swiss, who've got the longest history in democracy and referendums, and I think this year they had a referendum about the introduction of a basic income. And of course, everyone might say, well, we are in favor of that and the discussed amounts. Now, this is an issue which is being discussed here as well, and the result was not positive. So the Swiss are not fully in favor of this unconditional basic salary or wage. Now, I think in Switzerland we have mature citizens, and in this case a populist movement might not make its way as easily as in other countries. Well, thank you very much. I'm really grateful for this question, because the internet is not only for shitstorm, but also for blockchains. Now, this is an application which have come from the computer scientists, and banks and states are using this system now. And therefore, you also have to take into account the ambivalence of the internet and nerds. Now, because of the blockchain, they are in a position to do something in a constructive manner for the entire society, which is being discussed on all levels of the society. Well, yes, blockchains are used, in the context of bitcoins. Now, this is a process how you can spend money. There are many people who said, okay, I'm going to pay for my coffee in Amsterdam. I can also pay for transactions. And the control is relatively high. Share prices for bitcoins have shown that things are relatively stable. Now, for instance, musicians can distribute their music easily, or certain insurance companies can spend money quickly and distribute money to people affected. So this means that we can operationalize things much more easier. But talking about this global currency system, it doesn't involve any responsibilities. Well, of course, you have to think about it, and of course it is complicated. The responsibility is transferred to the society of the nerds in this case. But everyone can have a look at the money which is being transferred from where to where. So this is a kind of crowd intelligence. Again, we, first person singular, can see what's going on. I think there's nothing better than that. About Switzerland, tradition plays a role, maturity, wealth, and the minimum wage is relatively high, comparable to that of a German professor. Do you think that this is good? Well, you know, there is a specialist for the law of the state, and he was discussing aspects related to dissatisfied people or dissatisfied politicians. You know, the Switzerland always is considered to be a country of satisfied or sometimes dissatisfied people. Now, a survey about the satisfaction or the dissatisfaction with political institutions on a Länder as well as on a federal level. So it is really no small wonder that, say, in Bavaria, that in Länder like Bavaria, population is very satisfied, because we always are looking back at our history, and some people or experts have been spending their time in Switzerland during the war and then came back. We have 18 referendums, but hundreds and hundreds of plebiscites since 1946. MELLINGHOF, you said it is not a problem of identity. Surely there are problems of identity on a federal level if there is no way of organizing things. I think you can practice such an approach. And we are always in a position to take our decision with a view to identities ourselves. Well, foreign policy, don't you think we are in a different position? A strictly neutral country certainly will have a different attitude in comparison with a country who has a say in Europe, so the implications might be different. Well, direct and indirect democracy, I wouldn't go for one or the other depending on such a situation. The question is, and Mr. Huber, if you introduce referendums on a federal level, do you really want to have people vote on everything? Or shall we have limitations, say, limiting or constraints related to changes of the constitution, or do we want to open it up completely? So what about the financing proviso? Don't you think that people also should vote on financing as well, and at the same time, and this is obligatory, they have to assume responsibility. You know, sometimes the financial aspects are being excluded, but if you think about these aspects, then no taxation without representation. The issues interesting in financial terms are the questions which you want to take a vote on, and of course also on questions where the money comes from. Mr. KORIOTH, in order to conclude, another question, please. Yes, of course, everyone has a chance to ask a question or voice his or her opinion. I have a question to the panelists. The fiscal policy of the ECB. The discussions are polarizing, divisive, particularly in Germany, and I think rightly so. Flooding the markets with funds. This is being criticized. Talking about medium-sized businesses, we conducted a survey and found out. That is, we asked our members about their opinion. And the opinions said, and the opinion was that the trust in solving structural problems on the part of the ECB or its policy was considered or was judged negatively. So there was not much agreement. Do you think that the authority of the ECB has declined vis-à-vis the national countries? Or was it not enough? Or didn't they force decisions on national levels? Well, let me answer your last sentence first. It would be a horror if the ECB would force national states to take decisions on a national level. They are supposed to do fiscal policy, and we, having an argument about the extent of their political mandate or fiscal mandate. The ECB cannot be removed from office, and if this were possible, then this would be some kind of dictatorship, and this is certainly not what we want. Another question? Georg Wertz. In addition to representational democracy and plebiscites, in between there are other solutions. For instance, an iterative democracy, i.e. the attempt where committees or bodies work out issues, work out questions, which citizens will then take a decision on, like Texans saying we should move from oil to alternative energy resources. Many people might say, well, there might be a good result. Is this promises? Is this a promising approach? Well, if I understand you correctly, shortcomings in a democratic decision-making process could be made up for by simply having, say, experts or pundits providing or supplying solutions or suggestions. I'm a bit skeptical in this respect. We have to do with the chains of decision-making processes. Sometimes experts might come up with better solutions, and then, we put these decisions into practice. I believe this is slightly undemocratic. In our representational democracy, we have to strengthen parliaments and have to make sure that they assume their responsibilities and gain authority. With so many surveys, we've got so many ways of influencing things. We've got NGOs, we've got the internet, we've got Twitter, etc., etc. Those who cannot voice their opinion in this day and age is something which I haven't seen. And if the dissatisfaction is on the increase, then there are many ways of committing yourselves and participating in political lives. The NGOs have really gained enormous influence all over the world, and the democratic legitimacy has to be, say, questioned, but I think we should stick with the representational democracy. Mr. Huber? Don't you think that we should vote in persons directly? And this is possible in some of the states. But the president is voted in directly and is then given permission to, say, drop atom bombs. And even the German federal president, who's got relatively little power, but still, there is a way of creating authority. Well, we discussed things yesterday, and of course I didn't take part in these discussions. But we said that one of the best aspects of the basic law is to dissolve the dichotomy between the Reichskanzler and the Reichspräsident and make available a system which includes them, involves them, but also have other entities. In this case, I think if the federal president gives opinions all the time or takes decisions, then this would lead to unrest. And we also had other systems on a lower level, directly elected mayors or others. Well, I would like to thank you for your participation, and thank you.